So I know this is your lunch hour. Please do continue to eat your lunch. You can have seconds. There's also coffee over here, and there's dessert in the back. But while you are enjoying your lunch, we have a very special presentation that is not on your program that we think you'll all be excited about. So I'm going to welcome up the President and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, David Trulio.
Thank you, Melissa. My lords, ladies, distinguished guests, it's my privilege to welcome you this afternoon to our centennial tribute to Margaret Thatcher, which pays tribute to her legacy of leadership and her historic alliance with President Ronald Reagan. For those of you I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting, again, my name is David Trulio, and it's such a privilege to work at the Reagan Foundation and Institute. Now, this is certainly a remarkable gathering, and although it's not practical to recognize each and every one of you, I would like to thank so many members of the Reagan Foundation and Institute's Board of Trustees who made the trip and are here with us today. So thank you, all of our trustees. Thank you for coming. So before I introduce our wonderful addition to the program, I would like to set the stage. In April 1975, Ronald Reagan was traveling through Europe, and he was eager to engage with allies and partners. During that trip, he was scheduled to meet briefly, just for a few minutes, with the then leader of the Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher. But those few minutes turned into more than an hour and a half of conversation. I'm sure the advanced people loved that. But in his autobiography, An American Life, Ronald Reagan recalled, quote, "I liked her immediately. She was warm, feminine, gracious, and intelligent. And it was evident from our first words that we were soulmates when it came to reducing government and expanding economic freedom." After their meeting, someone asked him for his impression of her. He replied, "I think she'd make a magnificent prime minister." The man to whom he was speaking scoffed, "My dear fellow, a woman prime minister?" To which Ronald Reagan quipped, "England once had a queen named Victoria who did rather well." That meeting marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable political partnerships and genuine friendships of the 20th century, a relationship built on shared ideals, mutual respect, and a deep personal bond that lasted a lifetime. We will explore that partnership more deeply in our two upcoming panels led by Peggy Noonan, beginning in just about 30 minutes. We're very pleased, however, to have an addition to our program, someone who can speak about Margaret Thatcher like no other. It is my great honor, therefore, to welcome to the stage Prime Minister Thatcher's only son, Sir Mark Thatcher.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, before I get to my prepared remarks, I would like to recognize a few people in the room. First and most importantly, our family referred to him quite simply as Charles. Lord Pole, he was my mother's, I'm not even quite sure how to describe him. He was a deep personal as well as a political friend, and led the political charge for my mother. Even though he was a member of our diplomatic corps, he made a greater contribution than any other single person on two legs throughout my mother's entire premiership, and he is a remarkable, remarkable man. He's had a bit of a tough time recently, but he's incredible, and it's just, I'm delighted to see him here. Fred. Fred, I remember when we first met, and it was in 1998. You and your charming wife, Jenny, were in the White House, and that was the last dinner that President Reagan gave, and he wanted my mother to be the guest, and I think it was in November 1988. You were there, and it was an incredible evening. It was fun. There was not a lot of pressure. There were many, many friends there, and it was an evening that we all remembered, and I remembered you then, and we've known each other, you and Jenny, ever since. And you've dedicated your professional life to the curation and the curation of the legacy of President Reagan. and how well you have fulfilled this obligation. And the only thing I can say is that he would be so proud of his choice that he made to ask you to do it. And many, many congratulations to both you and your charming wife. Peggy Noonan, the quality and style of your writing sets the standards for all of us to aspire and perhaps someday for us to attain. One of the very few people of whom it can be said that you gave journalism a good name. And you and Walter Cronkite, in my eyes, stand on a pedestal above everybody else. And it's such a joy to see you here today. Bless you. And finally, just a little bit of local. Donald Blaney, who is the chairman or the director of our own Thatcher Centre and the architect of last Monday's evening event. Thank you, Donald. You're a great guy. It's a pleasure to see you here. My Lord Pole, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends of Ronald Reagan, friends of Margaret Thatcher. It is a special pleasure for Sarah and I to be here today and to recall some of the life and times of my mother and President Reagan. Historians have already recorded that President Reagan was a great president whose impact has lasted many decades since his departure from the White House. From my meetings with him, it was obvious how he was able to once again instill a sense of pride, a sense of assurance, and a sense of confidence amongst the American people. Both my mother and President Reagan became heads of government in similar circumstances. Each was elected after a significant period of economic stagnation. President Carter in the US and the Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan here in London. Neither country was in good financial or national health. I first met Ron in California when I think he was governor, but I also remember that Charlie Wick, Caspar Weinberger, and George Shultz were already in evidence. As David has already said, after both parties met, they became friends as well as political soulmates, and they based their common belief on small government, low taxes, and strong defence. My mother became Prime Minister a few months before Ron, when he arrived in the White House. I think it was in January 1989. The depth of their friendships became quickly evident. In 1981, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, deep off the coast of the South Atlantic, almost in the Arctic Sea. America, ever concerned about its South American neighbors, deputed Al Haig, the then Secretary of State at the time, to try to negotiate a settlement to the invasion, but without success. Even after, at the express instructions of the president, to warn the Argentine junta that the US would support the UK in the event that war broke out. Subsequently, war did break out, and the US was extremely and quietly very, very helpful. That favor was returned some years later when the US wanted to use our UK bases to launch a night bombing raid against Tripoli. No other European nation would even consider allowing overflight rights. But the UK government stood with the White House, and the raid was launched from UK bases, and it was both successful and safely executed. I remember when Mum was the first head of government to meet then Politburo member Michael Gorbachev. As we in the West were very keen to encourage the Soviets away from communism. The meeting was a success, and my mother made a quick trip to Washington, I suspect accompanied by Charles, as she was keen that the US should support him also before he became General Secretary. Another historical example of the power of their Anglo-American, or perhaps I should say, Thatcher-Reagan partnership. Both my mother and Ron would want me to recount the fundamentals of their cooperation, not because it is topical, but because it is that those principles remain relevant today, just as they were almost 50 years ago. Both firmly believed that the people should have the state as a servant, not a master, and that it is the family which is the basic institution of our society, and not the state. And most importantly, it is economic freedom that was the cornerstone of everything. It was, after all, the economic might of the West that eventually drove the communists to seek de-escalation, quite simply because they could no longer afford to keep up. It is only private enterprise that creates wealth, and all governments must encourage it. Increased taxation only provides disincentives. And both Ron and my mother fundamentally believed that less taxation equals greater wealth and production for all. Moreover, they strongly believed that our first duty to freedom is to defend it. And the price of defense remains the same: eternal vigilance. Resolve is not enough. We must necessarily maintain the military capacity to enforce that resolve. Consistent defense underspending is there for all to see, not least of which by our enemies. Eternal vigilance means defense spending must also and always meet the demands of today's world. In 1990, when the heads of state were all gathered in Aspen, Colorado, George Jr. was hesitant to fully mobilize American forces in what became Gulf War II. My mother then uttered those famous words, "Now is not the time to go wobbly, George." Both Mum and Ron would wish me to remind you of their steadfast commitment to nuclear deterrent. It has kept the peace for decades and will continue to keep the peace for many more to come. I well remember the drama at the non-proliferation talks when then President Gorbachev at Hofty House in Iceland, when President Reagan refused to give up the Star Wars defense initiatives, and this at the time when Russian perestroika was really in vogue and all Russians were trying to be our new friends. The president refused, and the talks collapsed, to the astonishment of most commentators. But he was right, and history has shown him to be correct. Who would have thought that after Gorbachev, another little Russian despot called Putin would arrive? And I can hear every day my mother say, "Well done, Ron." Born both almost a century ago, at which time the principles of the era was spend judiciously, save what you can, and borrow only what you can afford to repay. Public spending and taxation were, by design, strictly limited, far more so than they are today. I always have had it in my mind that there was a certain sense of destiny in my mother's early life. And I don't doubt that those who knew the president in his early life would have had a similar view. Sadly, my mother nor Ronald Reagan are any longer with us. But their legacy, their beliefs, and indeed their courage live on, now more than ever. We, as their followers and supporters, must vouchsafe and defend their ideas, their ideals, and their beliefs. And we must once again fight the battle of ideas and win them, just as they did. We must ensure that the vigilance that they jointly sustained remains ever present. For it is this eternal freedom that guarantees the freedoms that define us and join us. Finally, leadership is a lonely job. And in a sense, it should be. But both my mother and the President had each other's shoulder to lean on, to gain aspiration and insurance and strength. And in doing so, they forged a friendship that became emblematic of Anglo-American relations for decades to come. So let us jointly resolve to increase and renew those endeavours so that we may again continue to say, God bless America.
Thank you, Mark, for that fantastic addition to our program. To our guests, lunch continues until 1 o'clock, at which point staff will direct you to the Gladstone Library next door for our program to resume. Thank you.